Have you ever been in a moment where one sentence changed everything, where a single decision made you question your worth, your place, and even yourself? Imagine standing there, alone, not because you chose to be, but because someone decided you needed to learn a lesson, not a gentle one, not a kind one, a lesson that felt more like being pushed away than being guided, and in that moment you're left with nothing but silence. And your thoughts, but here's the truth most people don't realize. Some of the most powerful stories don't begin with victory, they begin with rejection, with misunderstanding, with being underestimated. What if I told you that sometimes the moments meant to break you are actually the moments that build you? This is not just a story about being left outside. It's about what happens when you're forced to stand on your own. It's about the quiet strength that grows when no one is watching. And most importantly, it's about a turning point so unexpected that it changes everything. So stay with me, because this isn't just a story you'll hear. It's one you'll feel, one you'll question, and maybe one you'll see a part of yourself in. Aim of rejection and humiliation forms the emotional backbone of this kind of story, shaping both the conflict and the transformation that follows. Rejection is not just about being denied entry or excluded physically, it carries a deeper psychological weight. It sends a message, often unspoken, that one is not worthy, not valued, or not respected enough to belong. This feeling becomes even more intense when it comes from someone in a position of authority or importance, because their words and actions tend to define reality in that moment. The experience can feel isolating, as if the world has narrowed down to a single painful truth imposed by another person. Humiliation adds another layer to this experience. It is not only about being rejected but being made to feel small in the process. It often happens in a way that strips away dignity, sometimes publicly or through harsh language, leaving a lasting emotional imprint. The person on the receiving end may feel exposed, powerless, and deeply hurt, as though their identity itself has been diminished. This combination of rejection and humiliation can trigger a storm of emotions: confusion, anger, sadness, and even self-doubt. At the same time, this theme is powerful because it becomes the starting point of internal change. When someone is pushed to the edge emotionally, they are forced to confront their sense of self-worth. The pain of rejection can either break a person down or push them toward reflection and growth. In revenge-style narratives, this moment is crucial because it plants the seed for transformation. The humiliation that was meant to weaken instead becomes a silent motivator. There is also a contrast between how the individual is treated and who they truly are. This gap creates tension and fuels the desire to reclaim dignity. The memory of rejection lingers, not just as a wound but as a reminder of what needs to be proven, not necessarily to others but to oneself. Over time, the sting of humiliation may evolve into determination, reshaping the individual's identity and strengthening their resolve in a quiet yet powerful way. The presence of an authority figure enforcing harsh discipline introduces a complex dynamic that goes beyond simple rules or correction. Authority, by its nature, carries influence, control, and the ability to shape behavior. When used appropriately, it can guide, teach, and protect. However, when discipline becomes harsh, it shifts from guidance into dominance, where the focus is no longer on growth but on control. The individual on the receiving end is not just being corrected, they are being subjected to a demonstration of power. Harsh discipline often comes with rigid expectations and little room for understanding. It tends to ignore the emotional state or perspective of the other person, reducing the situation to obedience versus disobedience. In such moments, authority is expressed through commands, ultimatums, or punishments that may feel disproportionate. This creates an imbalance where one voice completely overpowers the other, leaving no space for dialogue or explanation. The person experiencing this may feel trapped, unable to defend themselves or express their side without fear of further consequences. This dynamic can also create confusion about respect. Instead of being built on mutual understanding, respect is demanded through fear or submission. The authority figure may believe they are teaching a lesson, but the method often overshadows the message. What remains is not clarity, but a lingering sense of injustice. The person subjected to this treatment may begin to question not only the situation, but also their own worth and place within that relationship. At the same time, harsh discipline can unintentionally reveal the limitations of authority itself. It shows how power, when exercised without empathy, can lose its legitimacy in the eyes of others. The individual may comply outwardly, but internally, they begin to detach, observing rather than accepting. This quiet shift is significant because it marks the beginning of resistance, not loud or confrontational, but thoughtful and deeply personal. The experience leaves a lasting imprint, shaping how the individual views authority in the future. It can lead to a heightened awareness of fairness, respect, and the importance of balanced power. Rather than simply accepting control, the individual may grow more determined to define respect on their own terms, recognizing that true authority is not proven through harshness, but through understanding and restraint. The emotional impact of being cast out reaches far beyond the physical act of exclusion, cutting deeply into a person's sense of belonging and identity. Being told to step away, to remain outside, or to separate from a space that once felt secure can create an immediate sense of shock. It disrupts the natural expectation of safety and acceptance, replacing it with uncertainty. In that moment, the individual is not just removed from a place, but from a sense of connection, as if they no longer hold the same value they once believed they did. This experience often triggers a cascade of emotions that are difficult to process all at once. There is confusion as the mind tries to understand what led to such a drastic response. There is hurt, stemming from the realization that someone else has the power to exclude them so easily. There may also be anger, not always expressed outwardly, but simmering beneath the surface as a response to perceived unfairness. Alongside these emotions, self-doubt can quietly emerge, causing the individual to question their own actions, words, or even their inherent worth. Isolation intensifies these feelings. When someone is physically removed from a shared environment, they are left alone with their thoughts. Without immediate reassurance or explanation, the mind can magnify the situation, replaying events and imagining different outcomes. This solitude can feel heavy, as though time itself slows down, forcing the individual to sit with emotions they may not yet fully understand. The absence of support in that moment can make the experience feel even more overwhelming. At the same time, this emotional impact can begin to reshape the individual's inner world. Being cast out creates a moment of forced introspection, where external noise fades and internal dialogue becomes louder. The person may start to reflect not only on what happened, but on how they see themselves and how they wish to be treated. This shift, though born from pain, can lead to a deeper awareness of personal boundaries and self-respect. The memory of that moment often lingers, not just as a painful experience, but as a defining point that influences future reactions and decisions. It can make the individual more sensitive to issues of inclusion and exclusion, more aware of the emotional weight behind actions that might otherwise seem small to others. Silence and observation as power represent a subtle but deeply effective response in situations where confrontation may only escalate tension or reinforce imbalance. When a person chooses silence, it is often misunderstood as weakness or submission, especially by those who rely on dominance or loud authority. However, silence can serve as a deliberate and controlled choice, allowing the individual to retain their composure and avoid being drawn into a reactive cycle. Instead of responding impulsively, they create space to process what is happening, maintaining a sense of inner control even when external circumstances feel overwhelming. Observation strengthens this silence by turning attention outward. Rather than focusing solely on personal hurt or frustration, the individual begins to study the behavior, tone, and intentions of others. This shift transforms the situation from something purely emotional into something more analytical. Patterns start to emerge: how power is used, how words are chosen, and how actions reflect deeper attitudes. Through careful observation, the individual gains a clearer understanding of the dynamics at play, which can be far more valuable than reacting in the moment without awareness. This combination of silence and observation allows for a quiet accumulation of strength. While others may speak loudly or act forcefully, the silent observer gathers insight, learning not only about the situation but also about themselves. They begin to recognize their own emotional triggers, their limits, and their capacity to endure. This awareness builds resilience, creating a foundation for future actions that are thoughtful rather than impulsive. It also prevents unnecessary conflict, as the individual avoids giving others the reaction they might expect or even seek. There is also a strategic element to this approach. By not immediately revealing thoughts or feelings, the individual maintains a level of unpredictability. Others may underestimate them, assuming that silence equates to a lack of response or capability. This underestimation can shift the balance of power over time, as the silent individual is actually preparing, reflecting, and growing stronger internally. When they eventually choose to act or speak, it is often with greater clarity and impact. Silence, in this sense, becomes a form of self-preservation and quiet resistance. It protects dignity, prevents escalation, and creates an environment where true understanding can develop. Observation complements this by turning every moment into an opportunity to learn, making the individual not just a passive participant, but an aware and evolving presence within the situation. Hidden strength and resilience often develop in moments when a person appears to have the least power. On the surface, they may seem quiet, withdrawn, or even defeated, but beneath that exterior, something far more powerful is forming. This strength is not loud or immediately visible. It grows internally, shaped by experiences that test patience, endurance, and emotional control. Unlike obvious displays of confidence or authority, hidden strength does not seek recognition. It exists as a steady force that allows an individual to continue moving forward despite adversity. Resilience is closely tied to this hidden strength, as it reflects the ability to absorb difficult experiences without breaking. When faced with rejection, harsh treatment, or isolation, the initial reaction may involve pain or confusion. However, resilience allows the individual to process these emotions and gradually adapt. Instead of being overwhelmed, they learn to carry the weight of the experience in a way that does not define or limit them. Each challenge becomes a layer that reinforces their inner stability, making them less vulnerable to future setbacks. This kind of strength often goes unnoticed by others because it does not rely on external validation. While some people may measure power through visible achievements or dominance, hidden strength is measured by persistence and self-control. It is the ability to remain composed when provoked, to continue believing in oneself when others do not, and to hold on to dignity even in uncomfortable or unfair situations. This quiet endurance can be more impactful than any outward display of force, as it reflects a deep sense of self-awareness and emotional maturity. Over time, hidden strength begins to influence outward behavior. The individual becomes more confident, not because they seek approval, but because they understand their own capabilities. Their resilience shapes how they respond to challenges, allowing them to approach situations with calmness and clarity rather than fear or anger. This transformation is gradual, often unnoticed by those around them, but it fundamentally changes how they navigate the world. The presence of hidden strength also creates a sense of independence. The individual no longer relies on external circumstances to define their worth or stability. They develop an inner foundation that remains steady even when external conditions are uncertain or unfavorable. This internal balance becomes a source of quiet power, enabling them to face difficulties with a sense of control and purpose that others may not immediately recognize. The unexpected twist or turning point is a defining element that shifts the entire direction of the narrative, transforming what initially seems like a straightforward experience of struggle into something far more impactful. Up until this moment, events often follow a predictable path where one side holds control and the other appears to endure. The tension builds through discomfort, imbalance, and emotional weight, creating the impression that the situation may continue in the same pattern. This is what makes the turning point so powerful. It disrupts that expectation completely. A turning point does not always arrive with dramatic noise or obvious signals. Sometimes it appears quietly, almost subtly, yet its effect is immediate and undeniable. It introduces a new perspective or force that changes how everything is perceived. What once seemed like a position of weakness is suddenly recontextualized, and the individual who was underestimated begins to be seen differently. This shift can come from an external event, a realization, or an action that reveals hidden truths. Regardless of its form, it breaks the existing dynamic and forces everyone involved to reassess their understanding of the situation. The element of surprise is crucial here. Because the narrative has built up a certain expectation, the twist challenges assumptions and creates a moment of clarity. It exposes gaps in judgment, highlighting how quickly people can misinterpret situations or underestimate others. For the individual at the center of the experience, this moment often feels like a release, a point where the weight of earlier events begins to lift, replaced by a sense of validation or empowerment. This turning point also serves as a bridge between past and future. It connects the earlier experiences of rejection, silence, and resilience with what comes next. Without it, the story would remain incomplete, lacking the shift that allows growth to become visible. It is the moment where internal strength begins to reflect outwardly, altering not just how the individual sees themselves but how they are perceived by others. At the same time, it reinforces the idea that circumstances are not fixed. Even situations that seem firmly controlled can change unexpectedly. This unpredictability adds depth to the narrative, reminding that power is not always permanent, and that change can arrive at any moment, often when it is least anticipated. The arrival of an external force introduces a shift that the individual alone could not have created at that moment, altering the balance of power in a way that feels both surprising and transformative. This force is not just a person or an object, it represents intervention, recognition, or validation coming from outside the immediate conflict. Its presence disrupts the established dynamic, where control may have been firmly held by one side, and introduces a new perspective that cannot be easily ignored or dismissed. This external element often carries symbolic weight. It can represent justice, support, status, or truth, depending on the context. Its arrival sends a message that the situation is larger than the limited viewpoint that previously defined it. What was once seen as a closed environment, where decisions and judgments went unquestioned, suddenly expands. The individual who felt confined or powerless is no longer alone within that space, and the narrative begins to shift away from isolation toward acknowledgement. The timing of this arrival is particularly significant. It tends to occur at a moment when tension has reached a peak, when the individual has endured enough to reveal their resilience but has not yet had the opportunity to demonstrate it outwardly. This creates a powerful contrast between what was expected to continue and what actually happens. The external force interrupts the flow of events, challenging assumptions and forcing those in positions of authority or control to reconsider their stance. There is also an emotional dimension to this moment. For the individual, the arrival can bring a sense of relief, validation, or even quiet triumph. It confirms that their worth was never as diminished as it seemed and that the earlier treatment did not define their true value. This realization can be deeply empowering, reinforcing the internal strength that has been building throughout the experience. At the same time, the external force often acts as a mirror for others in the situation. It reflects the imbalance that existed and highlights the contrast between perception and reality. Those who once held unquestioned authority may find their position challenged, not through direct confrontation but through the undeniable presence of something greater than their control. This shift does not always require words or conflict, as its impact is often felt through the change in atmosphere and understanding. The contrast between power and vulnerability creates a dynamic tension that drives emotional depth and meaning within the narrative. Power is often displayed through control, authority, confidence, and the ability to influence outcomes, while vulnerability is associated with exposure, uncertainty, and a lack of control. When these two states exist side by side, the difference becomes more visible and impactful. The individual in a vulnerable position may appear weak or defenseless at first, especially when compared to someone who holds authority or dominance. This imbalance shapes how actions are interpreted and how roles are defined in the moment. However, vulnerability is not as simple as it appears. While it may involve discomfort and emotional exposure, it also carries a form of honesty and authenticity that power sometimes lacks. The person experiencing vulnerability is often forced to confront their true feelings, stripping away any pretense or illusion of control. This raw state can reveal inner strength that is not immediately obvious, as enduring such moments requires courage and resilience. In contrast, visible power may rely on external factors such as position or status, which can shift or be challenged over time. The interaction between power and vulnerability, often highlights how temporary and situational power can be. Someone who appears dominant in one moment may lose that advantage when circumstances change, while the individual who seemed vulnerable may gain strength through endurance and self-awareness. This shifting balance adds complexity to the narrative, showing that neither state is fixed or absolute. Instead, they exist in relation to each other, constantly influencing how situations unfold. This contrast also affects perception. Observers may initially align with visible power, assuming it represents authority or correctness. Yet as the situation develops, vulnerability can evoke empathy and understanding, encouraging a reassessment of initial judgments. The individual who remains composed despite being in a vulnerable position may gradually command respect in a different, more meaningful way. Their strength is not imposed but recognized. Over time, the line between power and vulnerability can blur. The experience of vulnerability can lead to growth, transforming it into a source of inner power. Meanwhile, unchecked power can reveal its own weaknesses, especially when it lacks empathy or fairness. This interplay emphasizes that true strength often lies not in dominance, but in the ability to endure, adapt, and remain grounded despite imbalance. Breaking stereotypes about worth and respect challenges the assumptions that people often carry about who deserves recognition, dignity, or authority. Stereotypes are usually formed through repeated social patterns, expectations, or biases that simplify individuals into predefined roles. These assumptions can be based on age, appearance, background, behavior, or perceived status, and they tend to influence how someone is treated even before they have a chance to prove themselves. In situations shaped by conflict or imbalance, these stereotypes can become even more pronounced, reinforcing unfair judgments and limiting how a person is seen. When someone is underestimated due to these assumptions, their worth is often dismissed or minimized. Respect, instead of being offered as a basic human value, becomes conditional, tied to whether the individual fits certain expectations. This creates an environment where people are not evaluated for who they truly are, but for how closely they align with these preconceived ideas. The result is a gap between perception and reality, where a person's true capabilities, character, and resilience remain hidden beneath layers of bias. Breaking these stereotypes requires more than direct confrontation. It often happens through actions that quietly contradict expectations. When an individual responds with composure, strength, or unexpected capability, it disrupts the narrative that others have constructed about them. This disruption forces a reassessment, as the original assumptions no longer hold true. The shift may not happen instantly, but it creates a lasting impression that challenges the validity of those stereotypes. This process also redefines the idea of respect. Instead of being something granted based on status or conformity, respect begins to emerge as something earned through authenticity, resilience, and integrity. The individual demonstrates that worth is not determined by external labels but by inner qualities and actions. This realization can be transformative, not only for the person experiencing it, but also for those observing the change. At a deeper level, breaking stereotypes exposes the limitations of narrow thinking. It reveals how easily people can misjudge others, and how those judgments can influence behavior in unfair ways. By challenging these assumptions, the individual not only reclaims their own sense of worth, but also contributes to a broader shift in understanding, where respect becomes more inclusive and grounded in genuine recognition rather than superficial criteria. Symbolism of status, such as the presence of something like a limousine, operates as a powerful visual representation of power, recognition, and societal value. Objects associated with status are rarely just functional, they carry meaning shaped by cultural perception. A limousine, for example, is not simply a mode of transportation, but a symbol often linked to wealth, influence, importance, and exclusivity. Its appearance in a narrative immediately signals a shift in how a person or situation might be perceived, even before any words are spoken. This symbolism becomes especially impactful when contrasted with a moment of rejection or vulnerability. When someone is treated as though they lack worth or importance, the sudden association with a high-status symbol challenges that assumption. It creates a striking visual contradiction between how the individual was perceived and what is now being revealed. The object itself becomes a form of silent communication, suggesting that there is more to the person than what was initially understood. It does not need to explain or justify, its presence alone alters the atmosphere. Status symbols also influence how others respond. People tend to associate visible signs of wealth or importance with authority and respect, sometimes unconsciously adjusting their behavior in response. This reveals how much external markers can shape social interactions, often overshadowing deeper qualities like character or integrity. In this sense, the symbolism highlights not only the individual's perceived elevation, but also the biases of those around them. It exposes how quickly attitudes can shift when status becomes visible. At a deeper level, the use of such symbolism raises questions about the nature of value and recognition. It suggests that society often relies on external indicators to determine worth, rather than taking the time to understand individuals on a more meaningful level. The contrast between earlier treatment and the later presence of status emphasizes how superficial these judgments can be. What changed was not the individual's inherent worth but the perception of it. This symbolic moment often serves as a turning point in understanding. It forces a re-evaluation of assumptions and highlights the difference between true value and perceived value. While the object itself carries weight, its deeper significance lies in what it reveals about human behavior, perception, and the tendency to equate status with respect. The realization of true value is a deeply internal shift that changes how an individual sees themselves, independent of how others have treated or judged them. Before this realization, self-worth is often influenced by external validation, approval, acceptance, or recognition from others. When those are withdrawn or denied, it can create a sense of inadequacy, as though one's value is conditional and dependent on meeting certain expectations. This makes moments of rejection or humiliation feel even more powerful, because they appear to confirm those doubts. However, as the experience unfolds, something begins to change within. The individual starts to question whether those external judgments truly define them. This shift is not immediate or easy. It develops gradually through reflection, emotional processing, and the endurance of difficult moments. The absence of validation, while painful, creates space for a different kind of understanding to emerge, one that is rooted in self-awareness rather than external approval. True value in this sense becomes something that is recognized rather than assigned. It is not determined by status, authority, or the opinions of others, but by an individual's character, resilience, and sense of identity. This realization often brings a sense of clarity, as the person begins to separate who they are from how they have been treated. The earlier experiences of rejection no longer hold the same power, because they are seen as reflections of others' limitations, rather than personal shortcomings. This shift also changes how the individual responds to situations. Instead of seeking validation or reacting to every judgment, they become more grounded and self-assured. Their confidence is no longer fragile or dependent on circumstances. It is built on an internal foundation that remains stable even when external conditions fluctuate. This creates a quiet strength that influences their actions and decisions, allowing them to navigate challenges with greater composure. The realization of true value can also reshape relationships and expectations. The individual becomes more aware of what they deserve in terms of respect and treatment, setting clearer boundaries and recognizing situations where those standards are not met. This awareness fosters a sense of independence, as they no longer rely on others to define their worth. It marks a turning point where identity is reclaimed, and value is understood as something inherent rather than something that must be proven or earned through approval. The role of dignity in adversity becomes most visible when circumstances attempt to strip it away. Dignity is not something that depends on comfort or favorable situations. It is revealed in how a person carries themselves when faced with difficulty, unfairness, or emotional strain. In moments of adversity, when reactions could easily turn into anger, desperation, or loss of control, maintaining dignity requires a conscious effort. It involves choosing composure over impulsiveness and self-respect over retaliation, even when the situation feels undeserved or harsh. Adversity often tests personal limits, pushing individuals into situations where they feel vulnerable or exposed. In such moments, dignity acts as an internal anchor, preventing the individual from being defined entirely by the circumstances. It allows them to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively, preserving a sense of identity that remains intact despite external pressure. This does not mean suppressing emotions or ignoring pain, but rather managing those emotions in a way that aligns with one's values and self-image. Maintaining dignity in difficult situations can also influence how others perceive and respond. While some may initially overlook or underestimate it, consistent composure and self-respect tend to command attention over time. It creates a contrast between behavior driven by control or dominance and behavior guided by inner stability. This contrast can shift the dynamics of the situation, as dignity often speaks louder than confrontation, demonstrating strength without the need for aggression. There is also a deeper psychological effect associated with preserving dignity. It reinforces a sense of self-worth that is not dependent on external validation. Even when faced with rejection or unfair treatment, the individual retains control over how they present themselves and how they interpret the situation. This control becomes empowering, as it prevents others from fully dictating their emotional state or sense of identity. Over time, dignity in adversity contributes to personal growth. It shapes character, building resilience and emotional intelligence. The individual learns that while they may not always control what happens to them, they can control how they respond. This awareness fosters a stronger sense of independence and confidence, as their self-respect remains intact regardless of external circumstances. It becomes a quiet but powerful force that supports them through challenges, allowing them to endure without losing their sense of self. Quiet revenge versus loud confrontation highlights two very different ways of responding to hurt, injustice, or humiliation. Loud confrontation is immediate and expressive, often driven by strong emotions such as anger or frustration. It seeks to address the issue directly, sometimes through argument, raised voices, or visible defiance. While this approach can feel satisfying in the moment, it may also escalate conflict, reinforcing tension rather than resolving it. The focus tends to be on proving a point quickly, often in a way that demands recognition from others right away. In contrast, quiet revenge operates on patience, control, and long-term impact. It does not rely on dramatic reactions or outward displays of anger. Instead, it involves internal processing, strategic thinking, and personal growth. The individual chooses not to respond immediately, not because they lack the ability to confront, but because they understand that a reaction in the heat of the moment may not produce meaningful change. This restraint allows them to maintain composure and avoid giving others the reaction they might expect or even provoke. Quiet revenge is often rooted in self-improvement and transformation. Rather than focusing on the person or situation that caused the hurt, the individual channels their energy into becoming stronger, more capable, or more successful. This shift in focus changes the nature of the response entirely. The goal is no longer to win an argument or assert dominance in a single moment, but to create a lasting impression that challenges earlier judgments. Over time, the results of this approach can be more powerful than any immediate confrontation, as they demonstrate growth rather than just reaction. There is also a psychological advantage to quiet revenge. By not engaging in direct conflict, the individual retains control over their emotions and decisions. They are not drawn into cycles of argument or negativity, which can drain energy and distract from personal progress. This sense of control contributes to a stronger sense of self, as actions are guided by intention rather than impulse. The impact of quiet revenge often becomes visible only after some time has passed. It reveals itself through changed circumstances, improved confidence, or achievements that contradict earlier perceptions. This delayed effect can be more striking, as it forces others to reconsider their assumptions without the need for direct confrontation or explanation. The transformation from powerless to powerful is a gradual and deeply internal process that reshapes how an individual understands themselves and their place in the world. At the beginning, the sense of powerlessness often comes from external conditions, being controlled, dismissed, or placed in a position where one's voice and choices seem limited. This state can create feelings of dependency, uncertainty, and vulnerability, where the individual feels defined by the actions and decisions of others rather than their own agency. As experiences unfold, this perception of powerlessness begins to shift. the individual starts to recognize that while they may not control every situation, they do have control over their responses, thoughts, and personal growth. This realization marks the first step toward reclaiming a sense of power. Instead of focusing solely on what is being done to them, they begin to focus on what they can do for themselves. This shift in perspective changes the direction of their energy, turning it from passive endurance into active self-development. The process of transformation often involves overcoming internal barriers as much as external ones. Doubts, fears, and lingering effects of earlier experiences must be confronted and understood. Through reflection and persistence, the individual builds confidence not from validation but from their own progress and resilience. Each small step forward reinforces the idea that power is not something granted by others, but something cultivated from within. Over time, this internal growth starts to manifest outwardly. The individual becomes more self-assured, making decisions with clarity and purpose. Their presence changes, not necessarily in a dramatic or attention-seeking way, but in a steady and grounded manner that reflects inner stability. Others may begin to notice this shift, as the person who once seemed uncertain or constrained now carries themselves with confidence and independence. This transformation also redefines the meaning of power. It is no longer associated with control over others or dominance in a situation, but with self-mastery, awareness, and the ability to remain steady despite challenges. The individual learns that true power lies in maintaining integrity, making thoughtful choices, and staying aligned with their values, regardless of external pressures. This understanding creates a lasting sense of strength that is not easily shaken, allowing them to navigate future situations with confidence and resilience. The lesson that respect is earned, not forced, reflects a fundamental truth about human relationships and interactions. Respect cannot be created through fear, pressure, or authority alone, even though it may appear that way on the surface. When someone tries to demand respect through control or intimidation, what they often receive instead is compliance, not genuine regard. People may follow instructions or behave in a certain way to avoid consequences, but internally the feeling of respect does not truly exist. This creates a disconnect between outward behavior and inner perception. Earning respect, on the other hand, is a process that develops over time through consistent actions, integrity, and understanding. It involves treating others fairly, listening to different perspectives, and demonstrating a sense of responsibility and self-awareness. When respect is earned, it is given willingly, rather than imposed. It comes from recognizing qualities such as honesty, resilience, and empathy, which naturally draw admiration and trust. This type of respect tends to be more stable and meaningful because it is rooted in genuine appreciation rather than obligation. The difference between forced and earned respect becomes especially clear in challenging situations. When authority is used harshly or without empathy, it may create immediate obedience, but it can also lead to resentment or emotional distance. The individual subjected to such treatment may comply outwardly, while internally questioning the legitimacy of that authority. In contrast, when respect is earned, even difficult decisions or corrections are more likely to be accepted because they are seen as fair and justified rather than arbitrary or controlling. This lesson also highlights the importance of mutual respect. It is not a one-sided expectation, but a shared understanding that develops through interaction. When someone feels respected, they are more likely to respond with respect in return, creating a balanced and positive dynamic. This mutual exchange strengthens relationships and fosters an environment where communication and growth are possible. Understanding that respect must be earned encourages individuals to reflect on their own behavior and how they treat others. It shifts the focus away from demanding recognition toward embodying qualities that naturally inspire it. Over time, this approach not only builds stronger connections, but also reinforces a sense of personal integrity, as respect becomes something that is aligned with actions and character rather than imposed through authority. Conclusion. In the end, this journey is not just about a single moment of rejection or a sudden twist of fate. It is about everything that happens in between. It is about the silence that teaches, the pain that strengthens, and the quiet realization that true worth does not come from the approval of others. Every experience, whether harsh or unexpected, plays a role in shaping a stronger, more self-aware individual. What once felt like humiliation transforms into clarity. And what seemed like power over someone becomes an illusion when faced with inner strength and resilience. The story ultimately reveals that growth is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it happens in the quietest moments, away from attention, where character is built and dignity is preserved. The turning point is not just an external event, but an internal shift, a realization that respect cannot be forced and value cannot be taken away. It reminds us that even in the face of adversity, maintaining composure and self-belief can lead to a transformation that speaks louder than any confrontation. What remains is not the memory of being cast out, but the strength gained from standing alone and rising beyond expectations. It becomes clear that true power lies in self-mastery, in the ability to endure without losing oneself, and in the confidence that comes from knowing one's worth. The greatest response to unfairness is not revenge in its loudest form, but growth in its quietest and most undeniable way. Thank you for listening with patience and understanding. May you always find strength in difficult moments, clarity in confusion, and confidence in your own worth. Wishing you the very best in everything you pursue. Keep growing, keep believing, and never let anyone define your value. Good luck.